Dr. Eben Alexander and Karen Newell for joining the Conscious Community magazine today to talk about their upcoming class at the Infinity Foundation. And for those who are not familiar with Dr. Alexander and with Karen, they are first the New York Times bestselling author of Proof of Heaven and the Map of Heaven. And Karen is the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics. And so I'd like to kick this off by asking the question, what does it mean to access infinite oneness?
Well, I would say that that has a lot to do with evolving concepts of consciousness and what it is. For example, the kind of thinking I subscribed to before my coma, which is part of conventional neuroscientific assumptions, is that somehow the physical brain is creating consciousness out of just purely physical material, and I believed that to be true. And yet the evidence has been around for ages to tell us that is not the case. So this is really about the emerging view in the world of neuroscience and philosophy of mind about consciousness itself and what it is. And the model that's emerging now is one called filter theory, which is really much more about consciousness as being primordial, or something that kind of exists in supporting all of this universe. So it's really a much more expanded view, and when you realize this, then you find that going within, going into consciousness, say through meditation or something like that, is all about getting into that universal creative source of this universe, that collective mind, as Karen and I often refer to it. And that's where we can find so much more about our existence, about our sense of purpose and meaning, our interconnectedness with others, because it's really all about participating in this one mind that is generating all of reality. And I think this is where we truly expand our capabilities to manifest free will as sentient beings, is by having this much broader recognition of who we are and how we fit into the the much larger mind of this universe. And that's where I think that this kind of meditation and this kind of workshop comes in very handy.
Okay. Well, that's interesting that you'd mentioned your coma, and you mentioned meditation as well. And so, is meditation like being in a coma?
Well, no, I would say that what's happening in this kind of meditation is, for one thing, we're coming to acknowledge that the little voice in our head, that little linguistic brain that's also tightly tied to the ego, many people think, that's who they are, is their thoughts. And yet, in fact, that is just the tiniest little part. In fact, I love comparing it, as Michael Singer does in his beautiful book, The Untethered Soul. He talks about that little voice in the head as being an annoying roommate. And I think that's a very crucial distinction, because this is about developing the deep mystery of consciousness, and that mystery involves the observer. So we're really talking here about meditation being a pathway to coming to recognize that much bigger awareness that we are, as the self-awareness of the universe that's not so limited as our little egotistical view of who we are and our thoughts and personal identity, but actually coming to realize that the conscious awareness within us is much grander than that. So this kind of meditation is really a way of tapping into that more kind of infinite knowing and wisdom that is our connectedness with so much more in this universe. And that's why this kind of meditation can come in very handy for many purposes, whether it be seeking health in self or in others. The power of kind of placebo effect is much more powerful when we come to realize that that is about our deepest nature that's actually influencing our life. And it can do it through our health or through the health of others, through loved ones. This is a way of demonstrating the power of prayer through such kinds of meditation. but also this kind of going within is a rich resource in terms of guidance in our lives. And that can include connecting with kind of spirit guides, with kind of a deeper knowing in that universal mind, and even connecting with the souls of departed loved ones and that kind of thing. So this kind of meditation going within is definitely getting in touch with that universal mind and that kind of higher consciousness and higher soul. And in many ways, I'd say with a prolonged experience, if you do this daily and weekly and monthly, this kind of going within in meditation, that yes, you end up getting the same benefits that, say, for example, I got going deep into coma from this kind of connection to the universal mind. But the key is you don't have to die or almost die to get that kind of connection. We can cultivate it. And that's why Karen and I in our workshops are such proponents for people to go within and to meditate and start exploring that consciousness within, which is actually the creative source of the whole universe. So it's our way of going out into that connectedness.
Okay. There are a lot of individuals out there that have a hard time meditating, and I would say that I'm probably one of them. So how does sound really help to allow that or facilitate that meditation when quietness to a certain extent may not work for some others out there?
Well, I can answer that question. I was also someone who had a really hard time when trying to meditate because I could not get the constant chatter in my mind to settle down. And sound played a role for me in that my mind seemed to sort of entrain on a sound like a crystal bowl or a gong, something that had that constant kind of drone quality. So when my mind would get focused on that, I found that it would occupy me in such a fashion that I could pay more attention to my observer self, the part of me that watches my thoughts. And a lot of us aren't really paying attention to that observer self behind the thoughts. And that sound can really help do that. Now, sacred acoustic sounds in particular include what we call brainwave entrainment or binaural beats. And interestingly, some of those crystal bowls contain binaural beats as well in kind of a natural fashion. But what we do is we create very specific digital frequencies that are designed to put the brain into lower states of awareness, that theta range of brainwave state. That's that state between awake and asleep, what's called the hypnagogic state. And we're all in that every day when we first wake up in the morning or as we're falling asleep at night. And these tones can help to get you into that state where your body becomes very, very relaxed, but your mind is still aware. And that's when the thoughts can kind of take place on their own or fade away, but your awareness, your observer part, can either put their attention on those thoughts or something else. And that's what we try to engender with the tones that we develop through sacred acoustics.
Okay. That's interesting because I believe you mentioned theta waves. Is that it?
Yes, theta.
Okay. I've kind of heard those sounds before, and a question is, once you are in that state, how do you, in that conscious awareness, I guess maybe is a way to explain it, how do you reconnect with the brain? I mean, don't you have to bridge that gap once you come back, so to speak?
So I think you're asking, we call it sort of an expanded state of awareness. And what we do is, are you saying how do we reconnect with the brain afterwards?
Yes.
Yes. Well, what happens is your mind gets into that expanded state. And I think what you're getting at is we can kind of lose our ability to use words and linguistic function. And a lot of times when we get into that state, earlier you asked about connecting with oneness, and that's certainly possible. You lose your words. And that's a challenge in near-death experiences, too. What Eben experienced during his coma, he had no words, he had no language. And what we do when we come back from these experiences, whether it's a 30-minute meditation or a 7-week coma, is we find the words that most fit the explanation. Do you have more to add on that?
No, I think that's a very good point. And the thing is, and this is one of the reasons also why we are recommending people go within, is because so much of that kind of knowing and understanding and kind of perception in those modes goes beyond what we can possibly convey through language. And of course, our whole culture is built on, communication through our linguistic system. And yet the reality is people who have had near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences keep saying over and over again, is so much of it cannot be put into our earthly language. I mean, remember that our earthly language evolved to help us describe things like a trip to Disney World. But that language is not particularly well suited to describing events in these spiritual realms that are outside of space and time. And again, this is such a big reason for people to go within. The answers lie within us all. You cannot read your way to all this or watch all the DVDs and go to the weekend courses, forever and ever is not going to be enough to get you there. It's personal experience is very important. And this is why we urge people to go within, and why we share these workshops is because that going within, that subjective experience is far more important in our growth than anything and everything that we could convey through our linguistic system of explanation and rational thought.
Okay. So, a lot of us talk about, when we don't have the words, and I've had someone kind of explain that to me as well, is that it's a feeling, right? And so how do we know, or does an individual that takes your workshop, how do they know that they've really just connected and that they're exploring their journey or their true self? What does that knowing actually look like or feel like?
Well, I love that you brought up feeling, because that really is the key. The brain is kind of in the way, as we say. And what I really like to talk about is the heart, and how when we connect through the heart, there is no linguistic center in the heart, and it is really a feeling. And when you kind of gather the information out in the world, whether it's in your everyday walking around space or during meditation, I believe that heart energy, as you say, the feeling state, is really what's doing the connecting. And then it's when our brain gets involved that we have to bring words to it. So how do you know when you've connected? Well, this is one of those things, that I went through. I thought when I would connect sometimes that I was just making it up, or it was just my imagination. And really what it takes is practice. It takes a repeated kind of commitment to doing it over and over again. And after a while, you start to know the difference when it's just kind of an imagination or if something more is going on. And you can practice in your own, daily life with asking questions and looking for answers. So what I mean by that is in a meditation, you can ask a question and say you get an answer in your mind or something, a question about a problem that you're having in your life. And you get an answer and you think, well, was that really an answer or did I just make it up? You can kind of put it out to the universe with a feeling state to validate that answer. And then pay attention in your daily life. Maybe an email will show up, or you'll see a sign on the road, or someone will call that you haven't talked to in 10 years. And look for the validation through synchronicities like that in your own life. And the feeling state is really one of those things where once you get to that point, you know it. And these places that you're in, as you're getting to that state where you're kind of wondering, am I there or not? Is it really happening? Was that real? Was that really my grandmother talking to me? You really need to start trusting your internal experience as real. we've been trained, in our culture to ignore our intuition, to ignore our emotions, that emotions are actually a detriment. And what I would like to posit is that those are the things that are real in our lives, and we've been trained out of them. And so the more we can really trust our inner promptings, the more kind of connected we can really feel.
Okay, awesome. Well, we hear a lot about when we're children that I guess certain things haven't formed yet, and so is it a process of learning from what we see, and then we get to a certain age and we have to reevaluate whether or not those teachings have are true or true to us? What are those things that cause us to pause and look at everything that we've learned up to the certain state of that we need to become more aware?
Well, I think you're talking about sort of that age of reason when children hit around 6 or 7 years old, and suddenly everything, we have to start living in the grown-up way of looking at things. And I think you bring up an interesting point, because that childlike sort of way of approaching the world is actually a state that we can get back to, where we don't have all of those teachings and dogmas and that well-meaning people have taught us, but oftentimes they're completely contrasting what we believe as children.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that, for example, in all the work done at the University of Virginia to assess past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation, where the Division of Perceptual Studies there has more than 2,500 cases they've gathered over the last 40 years or so of past life memories in children that are very strong evidence for reincarnation. But they know from those studies that the time period in which you can harvest that kind of memory of a past life or between lives is really between ages about 2 and 6. So the children very naturally live in this world where they can have, what adults might call imaginary playmates, say the spirit of a departed grandmother or grandfather that plays with them. The astonishing thing is when you listen to those stories, you find that often the child may not have ever met that grandparent, in fact, may not have heard the name that was used to refer to that grandparent, and yet they know it. So there's a lot of evidence that those kind of experiences involve a real interchange of information of the child, of the young child, kind of across the veil with that spiritual realm. And I think the more we kind of pay attention to that and realize that that's a very rich ground of kind of proving the reality of reincarnation, and that any one of our existence is actually much bigger than just something that can be fit into a birth to death and nothing more kind of scenario, we start realizing that our existence is far, far grander than anything that I would have envisioned before my coma. And I think that's an important part of this change in worldview, is that much bigger vision of who we are and how we're interconnected across multiple lifetimes.
Okay. I absolutely agree with and understand what you just said. That makes a lot of sense from getting back to that childlike state of there's basically no knots, so to speak, and you're untying knots. I kind of like to look at it that way, to relinquish some of those barriers to truly understanding and identifying with oneself. I have another question here. How did the two of you come to collaborate with one another?
Well, Eben, after his coma, was exploring different ways to, or actually just one way that he had heard about, and that is these binaural beats. He was searching for ways to shut down his neocortex to kind of duplicate the scenario he was in when he was suffering from the bacterial meningitis during his coma. And So we met. I was already well into the practice of using binaural beats and making my own with my business partner, Kevin Cossey. And so when we met, we were both exploring this sound technology, and that gave us a common path to kind of explore together in consciousness. And so this business partner, Kevin, and I had been making recordings together for about a year when we met, and we would listen to them at the same time and then get on the phone and share our experiences. And so when we met Eben and let him listen to our recordings, we then, after he liked them so much, we invited him to join us, and we would have these three-way sort of what we called sound journeys from our three different geographical locations, but we would meet up in the consciousness space and then discuss our experiences together on the phone. And that kind of shared consciousness exploration is something really that we advocate for everyone. If you do have a friend that you can kind of listen and explore with, it can really help you validate.
Right. It's that whole process of meeting up in that space and kind of comparing notes after these sound journeys. In fact, I would say, we were very focused on doing them at the same time. We would coordinate through texting when we would start the recording. So at least we were all doing it simultaneously, if not, in very different geographical locations. I'm not even sure it's so necessary to do that, because you're really getting deep into the space, and with prolonged exposure, you're really outside of time and space. That's one of the things that's so powerful about these deep meditative experiences. But it really, as Karen pointed out, it helped us quickly to be validating, because we found that when we would do these debriefs after these shared experiences, we would find that we would experience very similar things, although we would have different ways of experiencing them. For example, Karen's partner, Kevin, or her business partner, Kevin, would often have very visual experiences. And his thinking was, if you don't kind of see it in your mind's eye, then it's not real. Karen was quite different in her kind of perception, where she would know things. She would be on these sound journeys, and even though she didn't feel that she was necessarily visualizing quite as much, she could know the same information. So in the debrief, it would become obvious that we had kind of met up in that space. We had similar experiences when we compared notes, but each one of us had very different ways of having that experience, whether it was highly visual or highly just knowing, other ways of sensing. But it really helps you to evolve this, to do it with somebody else, because telepathy is a very real phenomenon. I mean, that's been accepted, say, in the world of twins for decades. People have realized that twins have very strong telepathic connections. Well, turns out the rest of us have those capabilities too, but they may be a little more difficult to demonstrate than they are in twins. But we can all kind of come to explore that, and that's why having a friend involved in this kind of exercise is a lot of fun, and also helps you to progress more rapidly.
Okay. It's interesting that in those kinds of sessions, when you're really connected to others and you're sharing those same beats, I kind of notice that the vibrations themselves, and just curious to know what you guys think about this, but the fact that we are a large percentage water, do those the sound itself and that meditative state, does it make that water in our bodies all kind of go through the same wave, the same ebbs and flows? Would you think that that's a way of connecting us?
I'm not sure that the sound is the mechanism that's interfacing with the water, but I feel that our thoughts and emotions are the mechanism that connects with the water. And we very much, including in our workshops, teach about how to use that intention, how to use our thoughts and feelings to generate a certain kind of state within your own body, say the state of joy, or maybe even just the state of clarity or success. And if you can do that, then we feel that intention kind of connects with the sound, and then the vibrations of the sound work to kind of send that out into the universe, and then it acts as a resonance that then brings back to us whatever matches that feeling. And so I feel that the water is definitely part of that, and with our thoughts and emotions, though, we can affect that water with or without the sound, and the sound just kind of adds a sort of strength and power to it all, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, it sounds like reading your internal dashboard, so to speak.
Yes.
I'd say that's very much true. I mean, a lot of the work that Karen and I do is trying to get much more deeply into an understanding of how consciousness influences our health. Placebo effect is just the beginning. There's a tremendous amount of power that I believe that our conscious kind of free will of our higher soul can have in manifesting health. And that is not only manifesting health for ourselves, but also in manifesting health in others. And it's really that influence of consciousness. And I think it goes far beyond just the influence of the sound itself. And I'm not sure exactly where the scientific world is headed on this, but my own supposition is that it'll have a lot to do with a much deeper understanding of the biology of water, because I would say that our understanding of the biology of water at this point is still very, very primitive. Water is just an absolutely fascinating substance. It has tremendous potential. And I think also it's water's interaction with DNA. The very fact that in general, our notion of DNA and its role in heredity, in Darwinian evolution and all of that, basically runs into the wall that basically 98% of DNA, or over 98% of it, doesn't seem to function by that mode at all. It's what we call junk DNA. And you got to be wondering about our general notions about the function of DNA when more than 98% of it does not appear to function by the rules that we think DNA should function by. So obviously our understanding of DNA is very restricted and limited right now. And I would say that it's really the water-DNA interaction, and this will also involve something called biophotons, which are ultraviolet, very coherent form of radiation that's put out by DNA, but I think it's a form of communication within the cell and cell to cell that we're just beginning to kind of come to some understanding of. And I think it'll revolutionize our very ideas of DNA and what its true role is, as we come to realize that it's mainly serving as a way for consciousness to influence our biology and our health.
Wow. Okay. That you said a lot of things there that I, was writing down and said, I need to go and check that out and see what those terms are and what the advancements are in that. So thank you for bringing that to light as well. So as we kind of wind down a little bit, I have two more questions, and that next question is, how are the medical scientific community and the spiritual, I guess, community, how are they coming together, or are they separating?
I would say that they are very much coming together. This has never been a discussion of science versus religion. That's not what we're talking about here at all. What that particular discussion has really been about are those who believe that the material universe is all that exists, what in scientific circles would be called either materialism or physicalism, and those who believe that there is more to this universe. And especially when you get down to the whole mind-body discussion, I think the first thing that a truly open-minded skeptic would throw out is the notion that somehow the physical matter of the brain has the responsibility of fully accounting for consciousness. In essence, that is something that is widely known in philosophical and scientific circles as the hard problem of consciousness. And in fact, I would say if you really insist on being shackled and handicapped from the position of physicalism, it becomes the impossible problem of consciousness, because in fact there is no way to work it forward, and that's where we're hitting such a conflict in our modern science, because that hard problem of consciousness is so steep and so profound that there's no way of moving forward with just the physicalist position, the conventional neuroscientific position that somehow the brain must create consciousness. And so it's really about a much bigger worldview that is evolving now, and that is one that many scientists and physicians are already very much on board with. Anyone who is educated about consciousness and mind-body discussion has come to realize that the physicalist position offers nothing at all. A bunch of hand-waving, absolutely zero. The evidence that the brain does not create consciousness is quite strong in examples such as terminal lucidity, where elderly demented patients can have these oases of great clarity and reflection that has no explanation at all within the conventional neuroscientific world. Likewise, acquired savant syndromes, where some kind of brain damage, whether it be a stroke or head trauma, autism, can unmask a superhuman mental capacity. Also, recent experiments, for example, using functional MRI and magnetoencephalography to look at people under the influence of very powerful psychedelic drugs, what you actually find is that the brain shuts down progressively to allow for the most profound psychedelic drug experiences. This is completely counter to what anybody in the materialist, brain creates consciousness camp would be thinking. So the evidence is all around us. The brain is not the creator of consciousness. And then it's really the question of where do we go forward in trying to make sense of it. And it's putting consciousness much more in the driver's seat. And that's where the scientific discussion is now. And in fact, the only way out is for science to really man up to this and kind of grow into the recognition that consciousness is fundamental. And it's a radical position. This is one that Karen and I talk about in our workshops, and also we've just finished book 3, which will be coming out in October of 2017, which is all about every bit of this and a deeper understanding of the mind-body discussion and what the implications are for all of this about our understanding of the nature of reality.
Okay. Well, that's exciting to know that you guys have a book coming out in October, and we will be looking forward to that. And I guess the last and final question is, with your class, your session, workshop, Accessing Infinite Oneness, I believe it's taking place April the 22nd at the Infinity Foundation?
Correct.
Okay, great. What can we expect? What should we walk away with or carry with us from that workshop?
Well, we'll be discussing a lot of the concepts that we've covered on the phone here with you, but we'll be going into much greater detail about a lot of the scientific concepts, how they really are combining with spiritual kind of concepts. And I'll especially be talking a lot about that heart and feeling states. And the real fun part of the workshop is actually experiencing together these sound recordings. We were talking about our duo and trio shared explorations, but when we do this together in a big group, we have some pretty amazing effects can sometimes happen. So it is really well worth people's time just to come and have that experience. And I believe Friday night, the night before, we're having an experiential only opportunity as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's really about accessing much greater kind of understanding, guidance, creativity, and wisdom within that collective mind. And this is a way of sharing it. I think most of our workshop participants kind of come away amazed that this much kind of liberation of conscious awareness can happen through something as simple as sound. It really is kind of shocking. We're taking advantage of a physiological effect that's been known for almost 200 years, and yet it's really profound and has tremendous power. And as Karen mentioned earlier, even if you're a very adept explorer of meditation, especially of sacred acoustics and that kind of deep transcendental conscious awareness, doing it on your own is quite different from doing it in the group. And the group energy is very profound and leads to a lot of kind of amplification of the process in many of the participants. So I would say it's something not to be missed.
All right. Okay. Well, I know that we're all looking forward to it. And I think with that said, I'm going to close out the session. And I really want to thank you both very much for joining us and giving us some insight into what you've learned and what you've experienced and coming to Chicago and helping us all understand more than what we know right now.
Well, great. Well, we love that Chicago community. We've been there many a time, and we love coming back there because there are a lot of enlightened souls in the Chicago area. And so this one is always a treat for us to return to that beautiful audience.
All right. Awesome.